The film opens in the year 1304 with Stirling Castle in Scotland under siege. King Edward of England was supposed to select the successor to the Scottish throne after the death of the Scottish king. However, he took advantage of the situation, seized control, and harshly ruled over Scotland. The Scottish people, led by Sir William Wallace, revolted against this tyranny, but were defeated at the Battle of Falkirk. Wallace was forced into hiding, giving the English the advantage in their struggle against the Scots' fight for freedom. With no other options, many Scottish lords chose to once again submit to English rule. Robert Bruce, his adversary John Comyn, and other Scottish nobles reluctantly pledged their loyalty to King Edward of England. The lands they had lost during their uprising were returned to them. King Edward appointed a viceroy to head a new council of Scottish administration, under which Robert and John would serve. As the nobles started to leave, Robert was challenged to a friendly duel by Edward II, the son of the English king. Robert fought him without much enthusiasm. The duel was interrupted when the prince was called by his father to respond to requests from petitioners. One Scotsman, James Douglas, asked the king to restore his family's lands and titles. However, King Edward refused, citing that Douglas's father was a traitor. Everyone was then invited to witness King Edward sealing the treaty with the Scots. He did this by launching Greek fire at a nearby castle and instructing his commanders to accept the fortress's surrender. During a grand evening banquet, King Edward of England arranges a marriage between Robert and Elizabeth de Burgh, an Irish noblewoman. Elizabeth's father is a close friend and ally of King Edward. Encouraged by his father, Robert reluctantly agrees to the marriage. His father explains that being in the king's good graces is crucial, and he believes that Robert will eventually be offered the crown as the king had promised. Upon returning home, Robert and his father grapple with the reality of their submission to English rule. Elizabeth arrives shortly after. She is introduced to Robert and his daughter Marjorie by the prince. Elizabeth warmly greets Marjorie, who introduces her to Jessie, her pet dog. Robert and Elizabeth are soon officially married, but Robert respectfully postpones the consummation of their marriage. As time passes, Elizabeth gradually grows fond of Robert and Marjorie. However, the burden of English rule begins to weigh heavily on the common people, who are forced to make sacrifices due to the rebellion. The king's men arrive to recruit men who can fight, as per their agreement with the king. When a soldier tries to conscript a young boy, his mother protests. Elizabeth intervenes, using her noble title to prevent the soldier from taking the boy. One evening, Robert's father shares tales from his younger days when he fought alongside King Edward during the Crusades. Despite once considering him a friend, he deeply regrets ever trusting him. Shortly after this, Robert's father passes away, making Robert the new Lord of Annandale. In 1305, Robert and his men journey to the border city of Berk to pay the taxes owed to England. After they've paid, they find themselves in the midst of a crowd gathered in the marketplace. The crowd is there to see the arm of William Wallace, who was finally captured and gruesomely executed. The scene turns violent as the crowd starts to yell and threaten the English soldiers. Robert watches in shock as the English soldiers start attacking the Scottish commoners who are trying to defend themselves. When Robert returns home, he tells his brothers about Wallace's execution and expresses his renewed determination to resist English rule. His brothers agree with him, and so does Elizabeth, who had been secretly listening to their conversation. Later, Robert meets Comyn in a church to seek his support. However, their conversation becomes heated when Comyn reveals his plan to inform King Edward about Robert's intentions. In response, Robert takes Comyn's knife and stabs him in the neck, killing him right there at the altar. Robert then confesses this murder to the Scottish clergy, who offer him a pardon if he supports the Catholic Church in Scotland. They promise to help him become the King of Scotland and lead the country against the English. Robert accepts their offer and is set to be crowned king in the village of Scone. Back in England, King Edward I is enraged when he hears about Comyn's murder and Robert's impending coronation. Prince Edward II begs his father to let him prove his worth by either killing or capturing Robert. The king reluctantly gives his consent. Meanwhile, Robert decides to gather the Scottish nobles and argue for a second attempt at independence. While some nobles agree with him, the common people refuse to support him. As Robert travels towards Scone, he comes across James Douglas. Douglas offers his loyalty to Robert in return for the promise that his family's lands and titles will be restored. Meanwhile, King Edward is busy knighting hundreds of men to accompany his son, ordering them to march under the dragon's banner. Amidst all this, Robert is crowned the King of Scots. Later, Robert has a meeting with Devlin, who is Comyn's brother-in-law. Devlin tries to act against Robert before the prince arrives to prevent any bloodshed. He challenges Devlin to a one-on-one combat, which Devlin accepts but postpones to the next day as it is Sunday. That night, the Scots celebrate and prepare for the upcoming battle in a nearby forest. Robert and Elizabeth share a quiet, intimate moment and consummate their marriage. Afterward, they tuck Marjorie into bed. Robert makes Elizabeth promise that she will protect their daughter no matter what happens to him. Later, Robert hears strange noises outside their tent. When he goes goes to investigate, a barrage of flaming arrows rains down on the Scottish camp. De Valence, choosing not to honor their agreement, had moved his forces into range and launched an attack under the cover of darkness. As the English continue their assault, Robert entrusts his brother Neil with the task of escorting Elizabeth and Marjorie to the castle. They are to seek refuge with Lord Fraser, a friend and ally. Despite putting up a fierce resistance, Robert is forced to flee the inevitable defeat, escaping with only about 50 of his men still alive. Beaten, bloodied, and desperate, Robert and his men wander aimlessly through the Scottish countryside. They eventually decide to head for the home islands of one of his allies, Angus MacDonald, hoping to replenish their forces along the way. They encounter John MacDougall, who is bitter about the murder of his cousin Cummin, but he allows them to pass unharmed. Elsewhere, Neil takes Elizabeth and Marjorie to Lord Fraser's castle, seeking some respite from the rapidly worsening situation caused by Robert's coronation. When Robert and his men reach a river, they try to cross it but are ambushed by the MacDougalls. During the ensuing fight, Robert's brother Alexander is impaled by a spear, and his body is left behind as Robert's forces continue to diminish. Eventually, the small group of soldiers find their way to the islands, where they rest and recover. Those who are able pledge to join Robert's forces. Meanwhile, Prince Edward is wreaking havoc in Scotland, ruthlessly killing Robert's supporters and pillaging or capturing towns and villages, including Robert's castle. When he arrives at Perth, he scolds Valence for letting Robert escape and for his incompetence in tracking him down. Shortly after, a loyal Scottish nobleman arrives and informs the English of Elizabeth and Marjorie's whereabouts. The prince gathers his men to confront Lord Fraser. Upon arriving at Kildrummy, the prince demands that Lord Fraser hand over Robert's wife and daughter or face an attack. While Fraser stalls by claiming ignorance of their whereabouts, Neil sneaks Elizabeth and Marjorie outside the castle walls, instructing them to wait and hide in the forest until he can send men to protect them and whisk them away. After launching a barrage of fire arrows into the castle, Lord Fraser offers to open the gates and allow the English entry. When both Neil and Lord Fraser continue to claim that Elizabeth and Marjorie are not there, Prince Edward signals his men to approach to show that they've already captured them. Unhappy with their defiance, the prince orders Neil to be hanged from the castle gates and is subsequently disemboweled in front of Elizabeth and Marjorie. He slits Lord Fraser's throat and orders Robert's wife and daughter to be returned to England as hostages. On the island, Robert is informed of Neil's execution and his family's capture. With a burning desire for revenge, the Outlaw King returns to the mainland. He continues to gather resources and allies, eventually concluding that fighting the English head-on will only result in defeat as his forces are still dwarfed by their enemy. The Scots decide to launch a campaign of guerrilla warfare, striking English fortifications in small groups and taking the enemy by surprise. After defeating the garrison at his castle and setting it ablaze, Robert allows James Douglas to take a handful of men to do the same. Soon, Douglas infiltrates his family's castle on Palm Sunday during Mass, when most of the English garrison is praying inside the church. He repeatedly reveals himself and chants Douglas as his men brutally kill their enemies and set fire to the castle before gathering supporters for his cause and rejoining Robert. Meanwhile, King Edward I continues to become increasingly aware of his frailty and failing health. In England, Marjorie is taken away by a nun to serve as a glorified hostage at a convent. At the same time, Elizabeth's parents are brought to her, and with her, Prince Edward II attempts to convince her to sign a document that forsakes Robert, annuls their marriage, and pardons her for her crimes against the crown. When Elizabeth refuses to sign it and laughs at the prince for his continued inability to capture her husband, she's thrown in a metal cage and suspended over the walls. When he receives word of another raid by Robert's forces, King Edward becomes angered. He decides to muster his army and lead them into Scotland himself, intent on personally ending the rebellion, as he had when he defeated William Wallace at Falkirk almost a decade prior. On the march, King Edward I faints and on his deathbed instructs his son to boil his body and carry his bones to every battle he fights against the Scottish. As the king succumbs to dysentery, the prince's final words to his father do not love as he mocks him and claims that his father treated him so poorly because he knew his son was much stronger than himself and was afraid of that strength. Before leaving his dead father's tent, Edward II instructs his men to bury the late king's body there and now, despite his last request. As the English draw closer and closer, Robert decides to finally meet them in a pitched battle rather than continue to run and hide. Despite his men's uncertainty, they choose to put their faith in their king and go about preparations, choosing a swampy battlefield to meet the English on and constructing large ditches filled with sharpened stakes to surprise the English heavy cavalry. Later, James Douglas is tasked with intercepting the prince and offering them battle at the designated spot. The two forces meet on the field the next day, the English numbering in the thousands while Robert's army is barely above 500 strong. Eager to prove himself and secure his position as the new King of England, Edward II orders Valence and many many heavy cavalries to charge Robert's waiting army. The English see the trap set for them too late, and as both horses and knights fall victim to the stake-lined pits, a brutal, muddy battle ensues. Even after Edward II himself enters the war with the remainder of his men, the Scots continue to cut down Englishmen and soon send them running to retreat once more. Robert and Edward II duel, with the former emerging victorious. Battered and begging for help, Edward II is spared by Robert and allowed to retreat with what's left of his army as the Scottish king claims his first major victory against the English. James Douglas would earn the nickname the Black Douglas and earn his family's lands back, while Angus MacDonald would be made Lord of the Isles. Edward II would return to England and be made king, only to be murdered by his nobles years later. The movie ends as Elizabeth is eventually set free in a prisoner exchange and rejoins Robert and Marjorie, and with that, the movie ends. We hope you enjoyed our video. Watch the next recaps on the screen and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing recaps. See you in the next one.